I think it's fair to say that Spock is the character in all of Star Trek that people have most discussed, being the only main character on the original series who was an alien, and in many ways serving as the one that all future alien hybrids and logic-based characters would be measured against. There is little that can be added after 50 years of careful examination of this popular character, especially with a number of questionable elements in his history and how one might feel about their inclusion. I personally feel that the out-of-nowhere half-brother that appeared in Star Trek V is best forgotten, along with all the rest of Star Trek V, actually. But the rest largely paints a consistent picture across the years of a man and his complicated development, yet who would nevertheless be an integral force in the Federation and the Alpha Quadrant. To discuss Spock's character requires going back to the very moment of his conception, because while that naturally is when everyone has themselves first shaped, in Spock's case it would lead to ostracizing. Spock's father is a full-blooded Vulcan, his mother is a full-blooded human, and yet Spock would identify as a Vulcan far more than he would as a human. Certainly his Vulcan characteristics overshadow his human ones. His ears, pigmentation, blood chemistry, strength, intelligence, telepathic abilities are not shown to be in any way diminished, despite him being a hybrid. Yet, despite seemingly only being recognizable as half Vulcan in medical tests, this would be a sticking point with other Vulcans for some time. Both the original series, animated series, and one of the films all made clear that Spock was on the receiving end of bullying and taunting. This might seem at odds with the idea of logical Vulcans, but, as will play an important part in examining Spock, Vulcans are not without emotion. They merely control it, and so children engaging in such behavior is disappointing, but hardly surprising. What is that this kind of thing would not be limited to childhood taunting, which we'll get to in a moment. Looking at Spock's childhood, we can clearly see that his father, Sarek, impressed Vulcan values upon his son, so that between that and the fact that he was growing up on Vulcan, it's understandable why he would be all the more inclined to consider himself a Vulcan, especially in light of those attempting to demonstrate that he is not by trying to goad an emotional reaction out of him. And yet, possibly as a result of this, Spock was very much his own person. He learned from his father, embraced the ways of his father, and yet was willing to defy his father repeatedly. Sarek confessed to Picard that Spock would go to the mountains for days, all alone and without explanation. When he refused to tell his father what he was doing, Sarek forbid him from doing it again, yet Spock refused to let that stop him, even when it resulted in punishment. Spock would merely endure it in silence, but continue to do it. Perhaps to search for something within himself, perhaps to have a place to briefly escape the stigma of being half-human. Perhaps merely an instinctual rebellion against the Vulcan society that he desperately wanted to be a part of, and yet was treated as an outsider within. The culmination of this, if one considers the events in the reboot films to represent the maturation of Spock, was his decision to join Starfleet Academy. Spock applied to join the Vulcan Science Academy, which is what his father wanted, and he was accepted. At the acceptance, though, the comment was made that Spock's success was all the more notable because of his disadvantage of being half-human. It was likely that, recognizing that the stigma was always going to follow him in Vulcan culture, that Spock declined the invitation to the Vulcan Science Academy and decided to go to Starfleet instead. It was that moment that he made the decision to commit to that path instead. This was doubly a rebellion. Not only was he turning his back on what his father wanted and a high honor in Vulcan society, but the fact that Starfleet was a military organization and Vulcans believed that peace should not come through force meant that Spock was, in a sense, rejecting the ways of the Vulcans. And yet, while in Starfleet, Spock would represent himself as a Vulcan, would indicate his approval of his Vulcan traits when they were brought up and contrasted with human ones. His good-natured sparring with Dr. McCoy frequently was about the physiological differences and Spock's preference to them over humanity. This is not a contradiction, though. What it indicates is that Spock refused to be defined by other people. Spock considers himself a Vulcan first, and a Vulcan that follows his way, determines his own values, decides what he will make of his life rather than conforming to any preconceived notions about it. Given this, it's no surprise that when the counterculture members arrived on board, that Spock could understand what they were going on about, that they too were finding their own way in contrast to prevailing culture, even if it was a misguided effort and their methods highly questionable. Spock is a good example of how you can recognize and celebrate the positive qualities of your heritage without allowing that to blind you to its flaws, to take the best of it and make that your own. But nevertheless, Spock indicated that he most feels that he is a Vulcan, confessing to Kirk at one point his childhood sense of shame over his human half. And even at the sense of friendship he has for Kirk was at first something that he was embarrassed and ashamed of that he felt. And while he would over time change his mind on that aspect and begin to openly value his friendship with Kirk, he nevertheless adhered to a Vulcan way of thinking and an emphasis on Vulcan ideas over human ones. By the time of the motion picture, he had reached a point where he was going to effectively expunge that part of himself through a ritual purging of all emotion. He, of course, decided that there were other things that he had to do first, though, and so perhaps that was for the best, because in the following film, when he was forced to sacrifice his life to save the ship, he was able at the end to assure Kirk of a sense of friendship for him. But nevertheless, that Vulcan sense runs so deeply through his character that Spock would need time after his resurrection to re-embrace his human aspects. This may perhaps explain why in the following film he has become much more comfortable with his human aspects, telling Valeris that logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. He has discovered the strengths that both of his heritages offer him, and that would indeed serve him well. Part of the reason for Spock's distinguished career, beyond his clear talents in a variety of areas, of course, is that he had a profound sense of respect for Starfleet and its members. He could have easily been insufferably arrogant to the human-dominated crews, given how much smarter he was than them. But instead of that, he saw the strengths in those around him. While he may perhaps quip with Bones about his lack of medical skill, in serious moments he was complimentary of McCoy's abilities as a physician. He had similar attitudes towards other members of the crew, acknowledging their strengths, even if perhaps he could have done a better job personally. Of course, the most notable is Spock's relationship with his commanding officers. Captain Pike earned such respect from Spock that he was willing to endanger his own life in the hopes of helping his former captain find a form of escape from his condition after the accident. And of course, his respect for Kirk was such that he developed a close friendship with him. And again, something he was even willing to later openly admit to. It is no doubt through their example that Spock began to see the advantages of the human way of thinking, how both men were capable of getting out of seemingly impossible situations through means that at the time seemed illogical, but ultimately proved to be correct. While Kirk on more than one occasion considered himself a soldier, in keeping with Vulcan ideas, Spock seemed to see himself instead in the role of a peacemaker, merely one that might have to employ force if no other options were offered. Spock is no doubt the reason that Vulcans became more and more willing to enter Starfleet, having broken down the societal barriers that discourage that kind of thing by achieving all that he does. His own father, who had objected to Spock joining Starfleet initially with this as the implied reason for it, seemed to come around to that way of thinking, because when he thought of who might be able to reach out to the Klingons in the wake of the Praxis disaster and try to achieve a lasting peace, it was Spock that he went to. And Spock acted upon this, making it the first step in establishing what would eventually be an alliance between the two former enemies. It's thus no surprise that Spock would likewise attempt peaceful overtures towards the Romulans, given the connection between their two peoples. After all, Romulans followed a path of embracing their passions, while the Vulcans one of logic. Given all that he had learned over his eventful life, he could no doubt see how each side could benefit from the wisdom of the other, to see how the two sides could be, perhaps, made one people again. Spock demonstrates the great strength one can have when one is an alloy, something that others might dismiss as being weak, actually being responsible for making the strong part even stronger. Thus why, even when it was revealed that the Romulan leadership had no interest in peaceful relations with Vulcans, Spock remained to try to encourage this movement from within and help these people to help themselves and bring about peaceful transformation to a new and better Romulus. Spock was for some time the primary representative of the Vulcan people for the audience, and it's no wonder that after watching him that they too are a respected race in the Federation and with fans of Star Trek. Spock was an individual, and yet never allowed that individuality to interfere with duty, obligation, and ethics. A man to be respected for his convictions and admired for his selflessness.
All hail the Overlord! All hail the Overlord!